Everybody, welcome to the University of Bradford and welcome to the Faculty of Social Sciences Public Seminar Series. You would have all been forgiven if you'd wanted to take out a very cold drink and sit out in the sunshine, but you're all politically engaged, it's good to see, and that's what we're really aiming for. The University of Bradford, in the lead up to the election next Thursday, is really hosting a plethora of events, really to try and think through some of the key issues which are affecting Bradfordians or citizens who are interested in the city of Bradford. So we've already had 4 fantastic presentations in this series, given by leading academics in the field, and today we've got the privilege of having Dr. Jim Goddard, Senior Lecturer in Social Policy, also the Head of Sociology and Criminology here. And Dr. Goddard will be presenting his research on some of the social policy issues within the 3 main parties' manifestos. So I'll hand over the floor to Jim. And just to say, I think the platform will be Jim, you'll talk for about 45 minutes. Yeah, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Okay? All right.
Thanks for that, Pauline. I'll go through my approach. It's quite nice that you're all here, and I feel like I'm preaching to the converted because obviously you could be outside in the sun, but you've chosen to come in and find out what is going on in this election in terms of the manifestos. When I was granted the privilege of giving this session, I was quite excited because normally, and some of my students have missed out a bit on this from State Society, and British Welfare State indeed, when we do social policy teaching in the middle of an election year, I get really into the election manifestos and I like to deconstruct them, if you like, particularly in terms of the social policy recommendations, go through them and have a good discussion about them. And I haven't been able to do that this year. I was able to do it in 2010. So this was my opportunity to make amends for that in a sense, and also just indulge one of my personal obsessions, if you like, which is that in general elections, and increasingly now that's more and more the case, we often forget that amidst all the fluff and the nonsense and the speeches and all the stuff that goes on in the media, there's one very simple way for voters to decide how to vote, and that is to get the election manifestos of the parties and read through them. They're not usually long. Whether you believe all the things they say in them or the promises is entirely up to you, but at least you get a narrative, and at least you get things that are written down on paper. And as we know, parties don't always fulfil their manifesto promises, but if they're going to do anything right, or they're going to do anything that they said they'll do, it will be stuff that's been written down in a manifesto. I'm going to go through, I've got a number of slides which will take you through the context for this. First time we've had a coalition government, for example, since 1945. There are a number of other things I want to explore with you as well around that. But before we do, I'm going to show you, just to prove that I am a bit of an obsessive about this thing, my fantastic collection of manifestos from previous elections. As just to take a few of the older members of the audience down memory lane. Kinnock, 1987, remember this? This is quite embarrassing for most of the leaders because the ones who are on it, they do look incredibly young. But that's the only one I've got from 97, which is a shame really. These two, 1992, Labour and a very, very youthful looking again, John Major. He didn't look anything like that the other day when we saw him giving his speech. I actually had one, apologies for any Greens in the audience, I'm not doing the Green Manifesto this time, I've not done it, but I do have one lone, historic 1992 Green Manifesto. I've also got the 1997 ones. That one with Tony Blair will probably be a historic document at some point, but nobody reads these things now. And this one, 2001. When Labour got a second landslide. This one, interestingly, it's one of the few without a picture on the front of the party leader. It was William Hague at the time. I don't know whether that's the reason it's not on the front, but it isn't. Some of you will remember the election, well, the last election, and this sort of retro sort of East European type of, or well, actually no, it's sort of Art Deco-y 1930s style as well, isn't it really, of manifesto picture for Labour. And the Lib Dem one, nice and small booklet. And then the Conservatives, incredibly retro, produced what looks like a book, a blue book, which, given that we were even then in the era of the internet, looked a bit old-fashioned. And it actually, literally, it's very much like a book. I am a bit upset this year. Some of you may be upset as well. I've been trying to get with Martin in the bookshop. He's been incredibly helpful. I've been priming him for weeks. As soon as the manifestos come out, I want copies, please. And he's been very, very helpful. And then he finally told me last Friday, he said, look, you just can't get them. The parties have published them, but you have to write off postage and packaging. You just don't get them in the shops. Now for me, I don't know whether anybody's protested about this, but there's a serious democratic issue here. Because lots of people are not on the internet. Lots of older people, but not just older people. And if they wanted to get hold of the manifestos in the way that I traditionally do at elections, they can't do it. Not unless they know where to write to. But for the savvy internet age people amongst you, which I think is probably everybody in this room, you can get them. They are on it. They are downloadable, all of them. I'll just show you what they look like. Most of you have probably seen the Conservative manifesto. All looking well, you know. I'll let you deconstruct the messages. There's no need for me to do that. But if you want to get them, I'd encourage you to do so and share them around, because at least, as I say, there is a democratic issue, but at least they're there. And send them to friends to read. The Labour one, a bit in your face, but they're quite detailed. And finally, the Lib Dem one. I should say, very colourful, very nice. The thing that took me back most about this was I got to the introduction by Nick Clegg, and he starts off with "Dear friend." And I don't know about you, but I read that and I thought, back off me. I'm interested, but just, you know, rein it in a bit. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, well, not going to go through all three manifestos. My basic strategy here is to go through the 2001 manifestos with respect just to social policy. And it is only some of the social policy measures. Because a lot of them, well, you can't fit them all on. And as I think Maria said to me, I have too many words on my overhead, so I've had to cut out quite a lot. And then we're going to go through some of the context, the social policy context, what's happened over the last 5 years, some of the issues. And I'm going to finish with the 2015 manifestos, which I was going through and culling out what were the main social policy measures. There's quite a few in there. So there's a lot left out, obviously, and then at that point we'll finish. I'll try and draw a few lessons, or my perception of what's going on with these manifestos. But I'm certainly not, I don't think I've got the last word on the subject at all, and I'd be particularly interested in what you all make of them, because we're all taking a fresh look at what these manifestos are saying. And although some of the measures in the manifesto have been trailed already, some of them haven't, and it is worth close reading. So, I think the first thing to do is let's go through the. I'm just going to jump ahead actually. I've got this whizzy thing which allows me to flick between. No, never mind. Let's go down this way. Right. Just a bit of context, and then we'll look at the measures in the manifesto. First of all, remember, cast your mind back 5 years ago. This is the first election, of course, when we knew it was coming. We've known it was coming for months because we have the date now set in stone, which is why it seemed like it's dragged on forever, and some people have already got bored. And it begs the question for me as to why the manifestos were so late in coming out. This could have been done a long time ago. I think it was Michael. Who was it? Which one was it? One of the political leaders was asked about this and said, I'm going to issue my manifesto as late as possible. I'm not quite sure what the logic of that was. It was the middle of it was the tail end of a financial crisis, but everybody was obsessed with the deficit, and everybody was obsessed with the threat to the country. And this was part of the atmosphere at the time. You remember that 10 days in May that David Laws wrote about, the idea that the Lib Dems and the Conservatives had to form a coalition for the sake of the nation, and they dressed it up in that sort of language. It was cuts, the competition really between the parties, certainly between Labour and Conservatives, to some extent Lib Dems, was not about whether we should be making cuts, it was the speed of them and what we should be cutting, and whether we should be increasing tax a bit more than cutting, what the balance was between tax cuts and cutting spending. So even though there was a commitment to cut on both sides, and it was about speed, within that logic there was an awful lot of room for manoeuvre about what gets cut and how it gets cut. So although you can argue that the political parties were essentially singing from the same hymn sheet, to some extent they were, if you look at the detail, there was a lot of choice in how the deficit was handled, and in fact we're still in that situation. Okay, so let me just have a quick look for you at the 2010 manifesto commitments. And I'm basically going to be doing exactly the same exercise for the 2015. And when you look at them, you'll notice that there's a bit of overlap. Some of the same things that were being talked about then have been trotted out again, but slightly extended. One of the things you'll notice is quite a lot of focus on children and parents and support for parents, whether that's through extending childcare, which again, I think all the parties are attempting to do in this election, free childcare. Basically getting more people, particularly women, into work. One of the things you'll also notice, particularly for the Conservatives, this thing about relinking the basic state pension to earnings, that's been done, and the focus on protecting the benefits of older people is very much a big part of the current Conservative electoral appeal. They're essentially not really going to touch anything connected with benefits for older people. And you'll obviously have your own views on the merits of that. It's quite a big feature in the Conservative manifesto. But lots of stuff about families, nursery places, flexible parental leave, Sure Start, and so forth. Notice this bit here. The right to choose alternative non-NHS healthcare at NHS costs. That's the Labour promise. But if you look at the Conservatives, they don't actually, if I remember rightly, say much about health. But in the manifesto, they promised that they wouldn't have any more top-down reorganisations. And then you remember Andrew Lansley, when a bit rogue, I think the expression is, and started introducing all sorts of changes which people arguably didn't really fully understand, possibly not even in the Department for Health. You'll also notice a little sub-theme in there, which the party, which has, in a sense, is a positive feature of what's happened in the last few years, which is that when governments now talk about health, and when parties now talk about health, they routinely bring up the subject of mental health, which has it's been probably growing for the last 10 years. There isn't a huge amount of money behind it as yet, but there's certainly commitments by all parties to varying degrees to try and address mental health issues as well as physical health issues. I could spend a long time on this, but I won't spend too much time. You'll also notice there's a bit of competition, and that particularly now around the minimum wage, and to what extent the minimum wage should be increased, who by, and at what speed. Okay, now I'm going to take you through the first thing that happened. I have got a copy, and I recommend you download it sometime. You remember that when Labour and when the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives got together, the first thing they did was construct a coalition document. That too is available as a PDF download, really easy. Just type in the relevant terms and it'll pop up. And it's very instructive reading for two reasons. One is for what it says, which I'll go through. I picked out some of the highlights, there's quite a lot more. I picked out the social policy highlights. But also for what it doesn't say. For example, it leaves out all of the controversial things that Lib Dems and Conservatives were likely to be a bit of a bust up about, even behind the scenes. It's quite a stripped down document. It leaves a lot of things up for discussion. Nevertheless, there are a few things that are in that document which do repay reading. Just to jump ahead a bit, one of the things you'll notice when you look at the manifestos, the commitments from 2010, What's happened in the meantime, the election manifestos for this year, and the coalition document, is that quite a lot of things have been done. There's also an awful lot of things that weren't achieved. And some of the things that weren't achieved by particular parties were because it was a coalition, and some things had to go. The Lib Dems lost more things than the Conservatives, but they basically gave up. And there's a bun fight, which was in private, but is now much more in public, about who was responsible for what in the government, particularly in terms of raising the income tax threshold and various other important measures, which both parties really like to take the credit for. There was a focus on reorienting Sure Start back to its basic model of, as it says, early interventions with families, promoting flexible parental leave. There's a big, again, I'm jumping ahead slightly, but one of the things I want to say at the end is you'll notice that there's been quite a big impact on all parties of gender politics in the last 15 years. The frequency with which things like parental leave and supporting women in the workplace and so forth is mentioned. You can regard it as cynical in terms of just a plea for votes, but it is there, the language has changed. I'd flag up that bit at the bottom about the guarantee of real terms increases in health spending each year. Because, as you'll see, that was seen to be, by the Conservatives, an important electoral guarantee that the health service was safe in Conservative hands. Margaret Thatcher had this problem in the 80s. Conservatives have always had this difficulty of persuading people that they don't really want to undermine or destroy the NHS. But the problem is, it was a big restriction on what they could subsequently do. And the reassessment of current claimants of incapacity benefit. All five of these, remember, agreed by both parties. This is what they could agree on. The reassessment is one of those things that rumbled on for years, causing all sorts of negative headlines. Yes, that's in the coalition agreement. Stopping top-down mobilisations of the NHS. I'll say no more about that. The triple lock, which has been repeated in the current manifestos, particularly in the Conservative manifestos, is essentially the idea that pensions will rise by either average earnings, in line with average earnings, or the inflation rate, or 2.5%, whichever is higher. So it's basically a guarantee that pensions will be pegged to earnings and possibly even over time increase relative to average earnings. And you can see it's the basic state pension we're talking about here, that obviously could have enormous electoral appeal. As I mentioned, the protection of benefits for older people, the free TV licenses, and it's everybody. This is what's been, you'll see when we look at the 2015 manifesto, there is changes on that. Labour actually wants to get rid of the winter fuel allowance for, I think I remember rightly, it's the top 5%. So it's not exactly middle earners. The Conservatives are keeping it, but around the edges of this allowance for the benefits for pensioners, there is a bit of give, because part of the rhetoric of the debate around the benefits cuts that have taken place is that we're not all in it together. The Conservatives, the coalition did say that there were, but there's certainly a perception that older people have really got away with a lot less of the pain than younger people. Whether that's true or not, I'll leave you to decide. The pupil premium for disadvantaged pupils, that's still an electoral asset, and I can't remember which things the Conservatives, could be the Lib Dems, have promised to increase it. And free schools. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things you'll notice, and it is a difference between the parties, is that although a lot of their interest in the welfare state will come up from similar angles, the big difference between Labour and Conservatives, the Lib Dems are somewhere in the middle on this, although they side more with the Conservatives, is about the role of the state in providing solutions. Often Labour and Conservatives want similar solutions, It's about who does it and who controls the process that they're most concerned. Okay. Some of my students will be familiar with this because I used this earlier in the semester. I only put it up. It's official data, as you can see, just to illustrate the context of the discussion. And the key thing here is the bit at the top. Well, there's two key things about this chart. This is about expenditure and receipts, and you can see you've got expenditure on various government items on the left-hand side and receipts on the right. And this is 2010-11, so just after the government got in. And the big white box at the top is the problem area. That's the bit that the government had to borrow in order to match its spending commitments. And you'll notice at the top on the left that there's a big chunk of debt interest. So that's the money that comes in that we just have to pay out to service the debt. But obviously, the money that's borrowed, the money in the white box, essentially, some of that is going to pay off money that we borrowed before. So clearly, we don't want that to be increasing too much, and ideally we'd like it to come down, because beyond a certain point, you're spending more and more money on interest. But notice also, and it's not very clear in that diagram, so I apologise, that health is a big budget item. Now you have two ways of tackling that deficit, and you generally tend to use two, but both in tandem if you're in recession. One is to cut spending, and the other is to raise taxes. Both of them will reduce the size of that box. The first will reduce the height of the left-hand column. The second will increase the height of the right-hand column. Either way, the box shrinks. And conservatives and conservative coalition governments have been inclined to focus more on the cuts, on the taxation side. Labour a bit more the other way around. The result is the same in terms of reducing the deficit, or broadly the same. But the decisions you make, obviously, not just in terms of whether you balance place the emphasis on taxation, or whether you place the emphasis on cuts, but who you tax and how you tax. Do you tax the rich? Do you tax everybody? And when you get to a position like ours where you say, well, things are improving, who gets the benefit of tax cuts? For example, if you look at the current initiatives to increase the tax allowance at the bottom end, the tax-free allowance for income taxpayers, well, okay, poorer people do benefit disproportionately from that, but everybody benefits from it. Even professionals on good money, if the tax threshold goes up, we all pay less tax. So in terms of targeting tax benefits on the poor, it's arguably not the most efficient way of going about that. A few more contextual slides, just to give you a sense of the arena in which these decisions get made. This is data from the Treasury, and it's public expenditure data. It just gives you a sense. As I've said, if you look at the figure for health, this is 2008-9, health expenditure, you'll see health, social protection, in other words, broadly the social security system and pensions, are the two biggest areas of spending, and then you've got education. So if you protect health and say, well, we're going to increase that in real terms, you've got to make bigger cuts elsewhere, which is why even the armed forces, which is a bit of a conservative issue really, have endured cuts. And if you are going to not be too hard on the schools budget, then you're going to have to cut elsewhere. And given that social protection is such a sizable chunk of public expenditure, if you want to reduce the deficit, it's almost impossible to avoid dealing with social protection and trying to find some cuts there. Obviously, of course, what a lot of this doesn't include, but it doesn't include at all, tax evasion and all of those issues about whether we are actually getting the money that we're entitled to in terms of the state. But we can't really tackle everything, and governments can't even tackle everything. Now, I've put this chart up simply, with this diagram up rather, simply to show you the sense in which, although the parties, certainly the Labour and Conservative parties, differ quite dramatically in some areas. Underlying their disputes, they do share a broadly similar analysis, which is that the welfare state element of the state, the expenditure on social protection, has been increasing significantly as a proportion, as you can see, of gross domestic product, or in other words, as a proportion of our national wealth. We are spending more and more on welfare, and this, as you can see, it goes from 1948-9, just after the Second World War, up to 2008, and the big bumps really are recessions. What happens in a recession? Obviously, you get a lot of people who get unemployed, lots of benefits. So there's temporary booms and slumps, if you like, in welfare spending. But the key issue is the underlying trend. And if you recognise, as most politicians do, that there is an underlying trend, you're inclined to think it's a problem. Because if you spend an increasing amount of your money on the welfare, social security benefits particularly, then you have less money to spend elsewhere. And not just less money as a government, but less money as a society. Now, there is an alternative way of looking at this. And I'm not saying that it's the right way, but it just illustrates the fact that you can step outside of this agenda and raise questions about it, which is, if we spend more money on certain welfare issues, like supporting, here's an example, 20, 30 years ago, there was not much funding around for carers. In other words, people who stayed at home and looked after their ill parents or their ill siblings, or even children who looked after their mother because she was disabled. Now we have more funding for people like carers and other people. And we can regard that as a good thing. I think most people would think it's a good thing. But it ratchets up the welfare bill. Now, if we become an increasingly wealthy society, as we are, that's the one thing we can agree on, can I take questions at the end? Is that all right? Because otherwise I'll get... Unless there's something really, really urgent you want to get off your chest. Yeah? Come on.
Is it that the totality has gone up, or is the definition of what social security benefit has increased?
The definition changes. I wouldn't say it's necessarily increased, but it's changing all the time. In terms of whether you, for example, when Gordon Brown introduced tax credits, you can regard tax credits as if you like giving something back, or you can regard it as a benefit. So there is a fuzzy area about how you define what constitutes social security. But having said that, the graph, if you like, it's too obvious to miss. But as I was saying, you could say we are more helpful now to people through the welfare state who have various needs that often were unrecognised before, and that's what we should do in a civilised society as we get richer. Because if we didn't spend the money in this way, well, maybe we'd be spending it on bigger cars, or second homes, or bigger DVD collections. Well, now you wouldn't have them because you download them all. But you can take my drift. You know, you can choose what to spend your money on. And if we're choosing to spend our money on social security, more and more of it, it could be a problem. It could be because of, in the common terminology, welfare dependency, or it could be because we are becoming a more caring, thoughtful society and choosing to spend our money on helping people who've previously been ignored. So there are alternative ways of looking at this as a problem. But generally, most politicians on left and, well, certainly the Labour Party, anyway, whether you think they're left or not, see this as a problem to be tackled, because politicians inevitably think we've got a pot of money given to us by taxpayers and we have to make choices. Politicians often, they think big picture, but they can't do big picture because they're limited by the resources of the state. So for them, it's just less money for other things. Okay, so this is a further way of illustrating the problem. It just shows you in terms of social security that trend, and it breaks it down a little bit. The dip at the top, if you like, where it goes down the other side of the hill, they're projections really, because as you can see, the data there is 2014-15, and we haven't got those figures yet. But that's where the current cuts are heading. The reason for putting that up is to illustrate what conservatives will often say, so as politicians, is yes, we have had fairly massive cuts, but if you like, in terms of the percentage of GDP, It's only actually taken us back to 2006, because it's been increasing so much that although it's gone down, we're not exactly falling off a cliff in terms of public social security welfare spending. So you can see, if you like, the parameters of the ideological debate here. Because when it comes to the details of welfare, you get manifestos, we often list this. But the difference between Conservative and Labour politicians, and indeed beyond Conservative and Labour, on the, let's say, on the neoliberal right, and on the more left-wing left, if you like, it's about things like this and what it means. You wouldn't want to, if you went back to, I've got a wonderful A.J.B. Taylor history of the 20th century, and he talks about the Edwardian period before the First World War, and he says about, if you lived in England then, it was quite possible to go through your entire life without the state realising that you existed. You didn't need anything. Going abroad, doing whatever you wanted with your life, you could just float by. Some people obviously came under the witness of the state, but most people didn't. But would we want to go back there? Whether that was a good or bad thing kind of depended on your position in society, really. Okay, so a little bit more context. Actually, no, I'm going to be away from context. I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 samples of changes under the coalition, just to give you a flavour before we look at the 2015 manifestos. One, and I tried to tailor this to things that the audience would be a bit interested in. Taxable income. The changes in there. Basically, there's a trend towards increasing the tax-free income at the bottom end. You can see that the target was the tax-free allowance going from 9,440 in 2013 to 10,000. And also cutting 50% tax rates. Now that, in a sense, is not really a financial exercise. You can dispute about how much money that brings in, whether you have 50% or 45%. It is fundamentally an ideological issue. So when Labour promises to reverse the 50% tax cut if they get in, it's not really about raising money. If you read the manifesto, it's quite clear that Ed Miliband's take on this is actually, it's a moral issue. It's about people who earn a lot more paying their fair share, even if it doesn't necessarily raise huge amounts of money. And it's hard when you get these sort of things in facts and figures and numbers to recognise that underpinning all of this financial debate, and this is why elections are quite important, very important, there are moral issues. They're often unstated. Sometimes they are stated, but they are about fairness, and they are about whether we're a collectivity or not, and to what extent we should keep everything we earn, to what extent we're responsible for what we earn, and to what extent society is responsible for giving us the skills, the wherewithal, the context, the mechanisms for doing well. I put the fees thing in, if only to remind you of the big problem for the Lib Dems in the last election. And you'll see that in the 2015 manifesto, it's a bit vague about universities. There is a promise that they will review student finance at some point, the Lib Dems, if they get in, to see whether it's working well. But clearly nobody wants to have to apologise again for things they said, and then they do. Labour, as you know, jumping ahead, they are committed to cutting the student fees from 9,000 to 6,000. I remember when it was introduced, and of course some of you will remember, particularly those of us who work in the university sector, when it was introduced that fees could be £9,000, it was actually, and I think that probably still is, they can be up to £9,000. Universities didn't have to charge £9,000. They could charge, if I remember rightly, it was between 6,000 and 9,000. So in a sense, Miliband is just going back and saying that 6,000 is a cap. But I remember, I don't know whether anybody else thought this, particularly my fellow academics in the room, thinking, as soon as this was introduced, this is absolutely idiotic, because it's obvious that no university really, apart from 1 or 2 that did try, I think maybe 1 or 2 that still do it, was going to charge less than 9,000. because it didn't make sense psychologically. Because students don't start paying this back, as you can see, until after they've graduated, and it's a graduated tax. You have to earn more than 21,000. So they're far less bothered by the paying it back in the future bit than are they going to a good university. And if you advertise degrees at £7,000, as opposed to the university down the road that charges £9,000, you're basically saying we're a cut price university. We are the Lidl of the university sector. And nobody wants to go for they may want to go to Lidl for their shopping, but they don't want to go to Lidl for their university education, because they're well aware that that will affect their references, where they can go for jobs, what people think of their degree. So anyway, the upshot was £9,000. And it was certainly quite surprising to me that the government really didn't. I mean, David Willits was involved, so why on earth he didn't see that, I don't know. It seemed fairly obvious to me that that was going to happen. And I'm just going to reference one or two of the benefit changes, partly because they've been so controversial. We know that universal credit, the logic of universal credit, is that we roll various benefits into one. We use modern technology, and if people get into work or do well at work, they lose benefits at a much slower rate. In other words, it's designed, I won't go through the technicalities, it's to make work pay. Because one of the problems, which to be fair, not only Ian Duncan Smith, but most people recognised, was the problem of the benefit system was that even if you gained from getting a job, you often had to work really hard just to make an extra bit of money. The marginal rate of taxation in terms of what you lost in benefits when you got a job was so high that there wasn't really much encouragement to get work. So universal credit is an attempt to try to do something about that, whether it will work or not, we can see. I put the bedroom tax in inverted commas in due deference to the government, so you can regard it as a bedroom tax if you like, because really technically it's a sense, what the government argues is that it's removing effectively a benefit that people who get housing benefits, who live in houses with rooms that they don't need, are basically depriving those houses from people with bigger families who could do with that house. So it just cuts the level of housing benefit, reflecting the fact that they've got an extra room which is being paid for, they don't use. Labour is proposing to get rid of the bedroom tax. The Lib Dems are going to review it with a view. This is an interesting bit, I'm jumping ahead here. What the Lib Dems have said they're going to do is they're going to ensure that people don't lose housing benefit until they've been offered a reasonable alternative accommodation for them to downsize to, if you like. So the bedroom tax, as you will still exist. It's just that it won't be imposed upon people until they've actually been offered a realistic alternative. And that's one of the reasons why Labour wants to get rid of it, because of the problems it's caused for people who, you can argue, are effectively being forced to move, even though, or losing money, even though they can't move to somewhere that is right for them. And ending universal child benefits. Again, I won't go through the technicalities, but one of the things you'll see in a short while is there's been a big trend, more or less over the last 15, 20 years, of reducing universal benefits, which everybody gets, and making them more means tested. And the most obvious universal benefit, which you just get for being parents, is child benefits. And the cliche example really was, why should Diana, the Princess of Wales, have got child benefit? And lots of other wealthy people, of course. So now George Osborne got in a bit of a pickle about this, or he got into trouble, because there is an issue around if you cut it for people earning more than £50,000 a year, and then what if you've got two people earning £45,000 or two people earning £35,000? They can actually keep their child benefits, whereas one person working with one not, even though the household has less income, they could lose it. So there's various complicated issues, and these sort of complications always arise when you deal with means-tested benefits. It's why people like Frank Field, for example, the Labour MP, who amazingly is still an MP, which is cause for admiration in itself, because he's getting on a bit now, is very much against means testing. He sees it as an encouragement, an incitement practically, to fraud, to keeping quiet about extra bits of income you get. It's in a sense a form of a morally dangerous practice. And of course the benefit ceiling, which is basically saying that households cannot get more than a certain level of income. If I remember rightly, I think it's currently 26,000, and the Conservatives are promising that when they get in, they will reduce it to 23,000. So no household will be allowed to get, even if they've got 8 kids, although there are exceptions, there's always wiggle room around these benefits, will be able to get more than £23,000 in benefits. And the argument there is very simply that £23,000 is, I don't know if it's below or above the average household income. I think it's still above. We'll look at some benefit figures and well, average income figures in a short while. So it's wrong and a disincentive to have households getting multiple benefits from all sorts of sources to add up to quite a hefty amount. Well, some people are just working and can't hope to get that level of money. You could argue that, if you were cynical, that it's a swap to Daily Mail readers, because anybody who occasionally goes to the Daily Mail website or reads the paper will see practically every day there's a story about a family with 8 or 9 kids and 30 or 35,000 pounds of benefits coming in a year, and that sort of thing. The horror stories are out there, and sometimes they're on television as well. This is, in a sense, a sort of reference to the what we've already heard of, which is the idea that we're all in it together. One of the things that somehow never gets, well, occasionally gets commented on in the mass media, is the idea that somehow people like journalists and head teachers and other senior professionals are middle income, that they are the middle class. They are, in a sense, middle class, if you want to define it in cultural and sociological terms. But in terms of income level, they are absolutely not. They are in the top 10% in terms of income, where possibly even the top 5%, because there are large numbers of people. You'll see the mean income is basically the average income, and this is, as you can see, where this data is from. I think it's from, let me get to the next chart, I think it's easier on that chart. 2010-11. The median, which is, well, 60% of the median is the poverty level. Let me just get back a minute. The median is the middle person on the income band, and the mean is basically the average. Now, if you look at that, all of these people, millions of people, and just look at this one here, 60% of the median, which is basically the recognised poverty level, not just in the UK, but most of Europe. There are different poverty levels. Some use 50%, some use 65%, but generally 60% is taken as the benchmark. There's millions of people here, millions and millions below the median, and even more. And the top end is skewed, because some of the people here, there's not many of them, but they earn such a large amount of money, relatively, that they distort the picture. So, in other words, the average wealth of people is not that great. So, if you're going to cut benefits at the bottom end, or you're going to affect a large number of people, possibly larger than you think. Again, this is a nice table because it represents this data, by the way. It's from the Departments of Work and Pensions, Ian Gordon-Smith's department. Is it shows children, and of course the problem with children is that we can all have moral arguments about whether some people are poor because they're not working hard enough, they're not lazy enough, but you can't apply that to children, which is why the child poverty targets, even the only thing you can argue about the child poverty targets is it realistic to reach? You can't really argue that it's a bad thing to try to get rid of child poverty. Whether you can is another matter. Just before we come on to the manifestos for this election, this illustrates what I mentioned earlier. This is from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Some of you may have noticed, I was in a lecture, I was teaching at the time, but the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which has this kind of guru-like status now, for some reason, did their analysis of the election manifesto proposals, the financial analysis, in other words, of the main parties. And rest assured, tomorrow's papers and tonight's news will be full of it, because they will be saying there is black holes, and this party is more realistic on its spending plans than this party, and it's basically seen as an independent audit, if you like, of the financial plans of the main parties. But this is IFS data, and it shows what I said earlier on, that there's been a shift towards means testing. Now, one of the reasons that means testing, why Gordon Brown was such a fan of means testing, and got into an awful kerfuffle with Frank Field about it, when just after Labour were elected in '97, was because it targets money on the poor. So if you've got a pot of money, and you're thinking, how are we going to help society? Because it's means tested, you do more good for the poor by using means tests, by using some kind of income threshold. And that's partly why it's increased. But also it's increased because, as some of you will already know, the Beveridge model of the welfare state, post 45, was based on contributions. He assumed full employment. He didn't assume that there would be periods of mass unemployment, as we had in the 70s and 80s. He didn't assume that there would be increasing numbers of single parents who were unable to work because they had small children and therefore would depend on the state. He didn't assume that we would have increasing numbers of people who would be claiming disability benefits for one reason or another. So the model, the Beveridge model, had room for means testing and for non-contributory benefits, but that has increased over time. And you can see from the top that the child benefit is one of the areas that's been squeezed. Okay. Three things about the 2015 election. You can see coalition government. It's a new thing. Well, new. We did have the Lid-Loud Pact in the 70s, for some of you who remember that far back, I do. Very youthful David Steele. They were all just so much younger then. But it was a bit ropey and it fell apart. It worked for a while. This was a proper coalition. This was Labour and Tories in 1939 to 45 coalition. It was amazing it held. People thought it would fall apart, but it didn't. You can regard that as a creditable thing or a conspiracy of evil, depending on your point of view. We're in an election where lots of smaller parties are playing an increasing role. I can't really comment on the impact that's going to have. Maybe you might have a view. And we're also in an election where there's competition around the end of the recession. If you read the Labour manifesto, and I very much encourage you to do so, you will see that Ed Miliband's narrative on this, the manifesto's narrative, is that it's not all right. The essence of his narrative is that, yes, things are improving in terms of GDP and growth and so forth, but ordinary working people are not benefiting. There's an increasing gap at the bottom. Historically, when the economy's moved up, everybody's moved up, and that's no longer happening. And there are lots of problems, in other words. Okay, so without further ado, 2015. And if I perform the public service, then hopefully this is it, because I've filleted. I'm sorry, that should be hours. I hate finding spell mistakes on my own overheads. I don't feel too bad about finding them in other people's, but when it's my own, I get a bit agitated. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to comment on all of these. I just want to scroll through it, because obviously for most of you, it's probably the first time you've had a chance to see written in black and white what the three main parties are saying. I'll comment on one or two. If, by the way, I don't know whether, Paul, are we putting these up somewhere afterwards so people can download them? All right, great, okay. So I'll send all this stuff to Paul, and you can download it and do what you will with it if you want. I'll just pick out a few points. Remember, I said that Labour wanted to end the winter fuel payments, but only for the top 5%. They don't really want to get around with too many people like this. I mean, it's hard to argue that the top 5% need this money. But you'll notice that when it comes to free bus passes and free television licences, I don't think anybody's touching bus passes. They all think it's great that every pensioner gets a free bus pass. And you know how well they're used, because 9:30 in the morning when you want to get a bus, they're all on there, you know. So how can you argue with that? And they all vote, they all like to vote as well, pensioners. One of the interesting things is the new 10p starting rate of tax that Labour wants to introduce. Some of you will, not too long memories, remember that Gordon Brown got in a total mess when he abolished it. I must admit, at the time, Frank Field had a real go at him about it. And it did seem to be a bit of a daft decision, really, because it was a symbolic easily identifiable, lower tax rates for poorer people, saying, okay, you're poor, you don't think you should pay more tax, but you're working, therefore everybody should contribute. Whether you thought it was a good thing or not, it seemed to strike a nice ideological balance that the Labour Party could say, we've got a 10p tax rate, because we recognise that some people, they can afford to pay a bit and they want to pay a bit, but they shouldn't pay too much. Anyway, it's coming back. There's a bit of ideology in there. The Conservatives want to increase their married couples. Here you can see what the competition here is. Married couple would like to transfer £1,060 of tax-free income to their partner. So it's gender neutral here, but no, we're not having that. We're not even having the little one we've got now. Labour wants to get rid of it. The Lib Dems weren't keen on it either, must be said. They kind of allowed Cameron to bring it in the end after he'd been badgered by right-wing Conservatives for years, to a point where he couldn't get out of it. But one of the things I want to focus on here, because I think it's interesting, is the Labour proposals on work. On the one hand, regular hours contracts after 3 months for those doing regular hours on a 0 hours contract. But I'm still puzzling. Maybe somebody can enlighten me on this. I don't know whether this wording is deliberate or whether I'm just being, a bit suspicious. But it refers to the banning of exploitative 0 hours contracts. Now, I don't know whether that means banning 0 hours contracts because they're exploitative, or banning the exploitative 0 hours contracts, but allowing some, which are deemed non-exploitative, to stay in place. And I'm not sure whether anybody's explained which of those two it is, but it could be very important, that distinction. And literally, that's about the use of English in a manifesto. The other thing as well, as I'm conscious of time, I don't want to, run out of time for questions, is out of work benefits for 18 to 21-year-olds replaced by a conditional youth allowance. And that condition is being involved in some form of training or activity or apprenticeship. In other words, you're not going to be allowed to hang around. So there is a little bit, as I mentioned, Labour does share this analysis that we need to do something about the potential for the welfare state to create dependency. You remember about a year ago, Ed Miliband's wobbled a bit on this. He started off a couple of years back, I think, saying we need to rebrand New Labour as One Nation. And you remember that speech he made when One Nation popped up, I think, 23 times in the speech. And then a little bit later on, it was about the Labour Party is for the workers. The clue is in the name, I think he said. The idea was, we are on behalf of the workers, we're not on behalf of people on benefits. We'll help people on benefits, but our priority is working people. And you've got that here. On the one hand, wanting to help people onto those contracts. On the other, saying, young people on benefits, we don't want to leave them there just to rot, if you like, and get out of the habits of work. And you can regard that as positive or ridiculous, depending on your point of view. And there is, there, very clearly, abolition of the bedroom tax. Not much room for manoeuvre there. I could say a bit more about all of these, and obviously some of you may have spotted things that you want to ask questions about or talk about. I just want to finish with, this is basically my points here, or what I think stands out for me, and it's quite simple really. There's a shared commitment to deficit reduction. All the parties are still saying the same thing they said in 2010. We've got to get it down, but we're just going to do it in different ways and with a different balance. The Lib Dems have got this sort of, I think Nick Clegg was called the, it was to do with this, is saying that we will effectively, we'll have more heart than the Tories and more brains than the Liberals. And somebody said, is he the Wizard of Oz then? And where's the courage, the strong man in all of this? There is the disagreement over the balance, the details. There is a shared commitment to the welfare bill, but there are strong disagreements about the role of the state. It's hard to spot this sometimes, but if you think about the Conservatives, and they tried to do this with Andrew Lansley, and it all went a bit wonky. The NHS is a very good example. The Conservatives would like more private sector involvement in the NHS. even if it's free at the point of use. And they say it's about choice and it's about improving quality. And Labour politicians generally do not want that. They think it will undermine the structure and the viability of the NHS. So I have got a bit carried away, as is my wont, but I've done quite well because it's under an hour. So thank you for that. I'm happy to take any questions you've got to ask.
Okay, so thank you very much for that, Jim. It was a very informative and engaging paper, and when so much of public discourse around elections is very much based on personalities, in Bradford, but not exclusively in Bradford, based on personalities, it's really good to have such a nuanced look at some of the social policies which really will have an impact on people's lives. You know, whether that is tuition fees, the higher raising or lowering of tuition fees, to pensions, to bus passes. So these are real issues of concern for people. So I'd like to open the floor now. If you could just introduce yourself before asking that question, asking a question, that would be useful. So, any questions?
Hello, yes, I'm Joanna Spink. I teach in Criminology at the university. Jim, have any of the parties given any indication about the finances for criminology, for crime, for policing, for prisons, for community-based organisations?
I didn't look very hard at that, if I'm honest. It was one of the things I sort of kind of ignored, but they are all there in the manifesto. I know that the police Federation are not very keen on the Conservatives at the moment. I think they're expecting cuts in reform, and certainly Theresa May has been trying to reform the police for quite a long time. They're not exactly pals in the way the Conservatives used to be. But in terms of the financial implications and so forth, I don't know. But do have a look at the manifestos, because I think pretty much all the manifestos, they all have a sizable crime bit, and they always do have, because they recognise, although it doesn't get a lot of publicity at the moment, it's one of the things that voters always focus on. In fact, traditionally, as you may know, the Conservatives have often been seen as the party of law and order, and historically, that really didn't change for decades until Tony Blair, and Labour shifted its stance quite considerably. So now, in terms of law and order issues, the parties are not that dissimilar, really. It's probably the best I can do, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Tax. I'm dispirited that you didn't mention at all climate change, because the Labour Party manifesto does mention it. And of course what we should be moving to is taxing bads instead of goods. By bads, I mean in this case carbon emissions. And the government very sneakily 2 weeks ago doubled the carbon floor price to £20 a tonne instead of 10. And it's happening. And if this happened on a big scale, obviously it's the rich more than the poor, because they emit far more carbon dioxide from a larger house than a small house normally. And the whole structure of taxation concerns me. That's the major point. The minor point is the 50% tax rate. I really am cross about people saying over and over again, wouldn't make any difference. But, this is, I reckon, a Tory statement to make us think it doesn't really matter. 5% more on £1 million is quite a lot. And if people can evade it, they just evade it. We should be dealing with the evasion, not just saying, well, it's not really worth doing. But that's the minor point. The major point much more is what the tax is based on.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, the simple explanation, I'll take your point about climate change. I mean, actually, if you look at the manifesto, there was actually quite a sizable bit about the environment in more or less every one of them. It was just that I was focusing on social policy. So I'd have needed a lot more to go into details about climate. I mean, there was a link between climate change and social policy.
Absolutely.
But in terms of the number of the traditional social policy issues, I mean, it would have needed probably 2 pages to fill in. Because I could have actually put crime in there as well, which you can quite easily link to social policy in terms of particularly the victims of crime and also where crime takes place. So there was a lot I could have included, and yeah, you're right, I could have included climate change as an issue. In terms of the, I can't remember the sums. What I was suggesting is not that the 50% tax rate was a bad idea. But you're right, it makes some difference. But in terms of the overall tax hike, in terms of solving the problems of the country, it's not a huge amount. But the point I was making was, in a way, that doesn't matter. That argument about whether it brings in loads of money, it can be seen as a smokescreen, because you can actually make a very effective argument about fairness. And it's the simple reality that if, 50% on £150,000 is still rich at the end of that. It's not actually that a problem for people. My view of this is if people feel that they need to run away to Switzerland because it's 45 it's gone up from 45 to 50%, then they've got a bit of a problem really. Because what they're saying is, they probably won't go, but some people would say they'll threaten to do it, and you think, well, why would you go to Switzerland? Because you're slightly less rich than you were last week. It doesn't seem a calculation that most of us would make. And so I would say, yes, I don't know the maths, and it certainly brings in some money. But in terms of if you want to solve the problems of the country, it's not really, it wouldn't be top of your list. You get far more money, for example, than by putting a few pence on wine or beer, in terms of the actual cash you get.
Any other questions?
Well, thanks very much for a really good talk. I just wanted to ask, do you think it's important to emphasise difference between income distribution and wealth distribution? And do you think if you put up a graph of wealth distribution, this skew would be even more amplified?
It would be, you're absolutely right. The income distribution chart that I put up, I'll just put it up again just to show you. If you look at the, I don't know whether it's on there, I may have cut it off in the analysis. Let me go back, where is it?
Do you mind if I just throw another question to you as well while getting it up? Also, on your other graph on the soaring burden of welfare, are you making the argument that the economic activity driving GDP is also driving the soaring cost of welfare and the need for it? So just those two questions.
Well, on the second question first, I'm certainly not making that argument, because as I said repeatedly, the soaring cost of welfare is a problem depending on how you view it. You can view the welfare state as, if you like, something that we do with the extra wealth that we have, which will tend to be, if you look at the Conservative manifesto, one of the things it says repeatedly is that a strong economy allows us to pay for the welfare state. In other words, to have luxuries that help people. But there are two alternative narratives about the welfare state. One is that it's about making society more civilised, and that if you're wealthier, then why wouldn't you want to do that? The other is to regard the welfare state as an investment. But actually, it's the other way around. That the strong, dynamic knowledge economy depends upon a healthy welfare state. So you just turn the relationship on its head. So one, you turn the dependency relationship on its head, if you like. Does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Okay, fair enough. What was your other question? I've forgotten now.
That was on...
I know what it was, yeah, sorry. Unfortunately, I had to lock this off to get the diagram on. But if you go to the original Department for Work and Pensions data, which I think, if you can't find it, I can probably find it for you. It says that this bit here at the top, all the people dropping off the end, there's quite a lot of them, and they've got even more money. But also, there's lots of people who aren't getting income, but they've got lots of wealth that they get in other ways. They're not on this at all. They're the people with the big yachts. The people at the top end, they might have some little sailboats, possibly, or small yachts. But all the really rich people, they don't even figure on this at all, because they don't have to go out and earn income, even doing really, really high-powered jobs. So yes, you're right, there is a whole other area outside of this.
Okay, there's a question here.
Thank you. Anthony Simmons. Thank you to the audience member who just sort of brought that in, because it's cued me into what I wanted to ask. I was quite struck by the fact that you said often two parties or three parties often want the same, but it's how it's done is the difference. I think our colleague here has said, and also why it's done. Because excuse me. So I think that's very important. As you've just said, in a certain sort of area in terms of social welfare, I could also look at education. Yes, we need a further educated workforce. Why do we want it? On the one hand, we want it so there's more factory fodder, or if you look down the route of the Mechanics Institutes and the WEA, it's for the growth of the individual, who will then contribute to a better educated and more knowledgeable society. If we look back to the experience of the First World War, where all these forced people were coming in, and the generals saw they were in a dreadful state, absolutely awful, and the movement started to healthcare, better provision of housing, blah blah blah. Now again, you can look at why, in one case, why fitter cannon fodder. In the other way, that it is hoping for a better society. So how are you going to build that in? Because you didn't really, you said how it's done, you didn't look at the motivations.
No, you're right, I didn't. And it probably is. I mean, that's a very good question, because in a sense, what we're focusing on here are the political rationales for action.
Well, it's philosophical.
There's a whole separate issue and debate to be had about education. Some of you, there's a wonderful clip I can't remember when I watched it now years ago, and it's of a Labour education minister after the Second World War, and I can't remember his name now. He was from a working class background anyway. He's explaining his philosophy of education, and he's saying in this broad accent, the way I see it, I don't see why a street sweeper leaning on his shovel shouldn't be able to think about Shakespeare as much as some other well-educated person who's gone to university. And it's that idea that somehow education is not just about improving us for the workforce, even if that's high-powered jobs, journalism, the law, etc. But actually it's about developing us as individuals, or giving us the equipment to develop ourselves as individuals. Politicians don't tend to see education in that way, because they're embedded in a system which is encouraging them all the time to justify education on economic grounds. So in a sense, the debate about the ultimate purpose of education, which is an important debate, has to take place outside, not outside the political system, but outside the language that politicians use. Which I guess is what you were alluding to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for that. That was hard coming inside out of the sun, but worth it. I wanted to ask, do any of the manifestos talk much about their party's attitude to the increasing role of the private and voluntary sectors in the health service and in social services? Because I know, like, at the debates and at various other things, the main leaders have all been challenged on it, and so because there has been a creeping privatisation. But I've noticed, particularly David Cameron and Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg, when they've been asked about their position on it, they've deflected by just saying, oh, we're going to put all this new money, we're going to put however many billions in. But that, as far as I'm aware, I've never seen any of them address particularly their views on the third and voluntary and private sector. So do they discuss this in their manifestos?
You think you cut me out of it there, really, because I didn't. Well, I'm not saying there is or isn't stuff in there, but what I read about the health service was a bit vague, to be honest, and I think it was deliberate. I think David Cameron feels he got his fingers burned with the Andrew Lansbury saga, and he didn't want to touch it at all. So the argument there is all about expending extra money. Like 8 billion more they're going to spend on the health service. That's in the manifesto, as you'd expect. In general terms, though, I think when it comes to the health service, they will make a big distinction, and politicians always make a big distinction between the voluntary sector, which they all love, and the private sector, which some of them love and some of them hate. So in relation to the health service, anything to do with the voluntary or charitable sector being involved in all areas of social care or health, They make lots of lovely noises. But when it comes to the private sector, not so much. But if I go back to what's in the manifestos, the bit about, well, let's just look at what they say about health. Because there is an implication in one of them, I don't know whether it's which one it is.
Yeah, and also things like social services and mental health, because I noticed they're talking quite a bit about mental health in this election and sort of putting more money into it, but not how or where they're going to direct it.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the parties, I think it's the Lib Dems, I think they promised an extra 500 million towards mental health services. It's either them or the Conservatives, I think. But I think all the parties have picked up on this idea of providing more support for mental health. I think I couldn't find anything on mental health in that. There's certainly stuff about mental health there that's relevant to your question. I think I may be thinking of the bit I showed you in the 2010 manifesto where Labour was saying about the right for people to get involved, go to a private sector provider if necessary. Some of which, of course, was introduced from the Labour government quite a while back. There's been, you can either call it creeping privatisation or improved choice, depending on your point of view on this. But it certainly doesn't, it long predates the coalition, this opportunity for the private sector to be involved at some level. Even if it's just things like cleaning the wards, providing the meals, and that sort of thing. One of the more interesting things about the manifestos, and this has been a bit of a book down mine for years, is that the Conservatives and all the parties are guilty of this. They keep saying, we are going to finally end mixed wards in hospitals. And you think, well, we are wealthy enough not to need mixed wards. And I mean, a big issue for me has always been hospital food. You know, the basic things, you think, I mean, I know people who've been in hospital and the food they get, some of it's good, most of it's just appalling. I wouldn't eat it. So issues like that, which actually are quite important to individual patients, tend to get ignored. Nobody mentions them. But yeah, I mean, to cut a long story short, I can't remember where. They say a lot about health, and I can't remember anything specifically tied down about the role of the private sector.
Yeah, so
my hunch is that they were a bit late.
Yeah, so they were just kind of being vague and saying big figures.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, as Kenneth Clark once said, and he was health secretary under Margaret Thatcher, the health service is one of those things that politicians fiddle with at their peril, because people get very exercised about it.
Thank you.
Just over.
Peter Nias from Peace Studies. This is just a comment really, but we've seen over the last Parliament many rushed jobs of implementation of new policies, particularly social policies. There is no mention, as far as I know, in any of the manifestos that each party would try to do an improved process of implementation of any new policy. Now, I mean, clearly they say that, of course, all of our policies will be produced and will be implemented fairly and everything. But at the end of the day, they're not. And I was just wondering whether any mention has ever been made of this sort of thing, to try and do it better next time, in whatever the topic is.
It's a very good point. Like you, I've never seen a mention of it. I think there's probably two reasons. One is that it's regarded as the sort of boring thing that voters wouldn't be interested in. I suspect the other is that politicians don't like to set themselves up for perceived. They don't like to admit failure. Which if they were responsible, they are saying we need to fix what we messed up last time. Or if they're in the opposite camp, saying what the opposition did was sort of okay, but we can do it better. They do it a little bit in the sense of parties often take on the policies of previous governments and then try to improve them. Schools is a good example with the Conservatives with academies, but they will very rarely say what the previous government did was okay. We just think we could do it better. It does happen, but not often. And I think also, I suspect nowadays politicians are probably a bit wary about making too many promises about improving things. Again, partly because of the experience of the Labour government. When you remember when they got in '97, one of the ways in which Tony Blair sold increased welfare spending was we will have targets and measures and performance indicators to prove that we are getting better value for money. And when that was implemented, even the Labour government eventually admitted they'd gone over the top. And people were sick of all this performance measurement and management, and they had to rein it in. And so almost every time you have a period of reform, sooner or later, it just gets, people are going to be carried away, and then they have to rein themselves in. But I mean, I'm getting away from your point, really, I suppose.
Any other questions? Just over here, over.
Good evening, very interesting talk, may I say thank you. My name's Roberts, and Chris and I between us, we have probably about 45 years worth of police experience. But my question isn't about policing. My question was really about social media and affecting public policy. I think this election will probably be the first truly social media election, in so much as yes, there was Facebook before, but this in particular, I'm thinking about Twitter. And I was interested earlier in your presentation when you were talking about the delay in the manifestos being released. How much of social media is driving policy, public policy, implementation and change? Because I find, I'm on Twitter a great deal, and I find many politicians on there, and they're absorbing the information that's coming through social media, and I'm wondering how much then is that reflected through public policy?
It's a very, very good question, to which I'm afraid I haven't got an answer. But you are right that a lot of politicians do use it. I find myself slightly surprised, because I try and go on it as little as possible, and I try and post on it as little as possible. But it's incredible the number of politicians who use it, and I guess some of them, to some extent, are using it as a substitute for what used to be the top measure for how you gauge public opinion, which was their postbags. Politicians will often say that, you know, if you want to influence a politician, write them letters. That's completely old school now. Email is old school, isn't it, these days? I suspect it's having a big influence, but unfortunately I'm probably the wrong person. I am the wrong person to ask, to answer that question.
No, and you know, it is in particular Twitter and the trolling on Twitter and the aspects of politicians being on there. I'm not saying there's any lazy campaigning going on, because I can see them probably, you know, out on the streets campaigning, their pictures on Twitter reflect this. But I'm just thinking, I was interested, you said the delay in the manifesto has been released. I think sometimes some of these social media aspects and the amount that's on there is now driving some of this public policy. They're listening in a different way to what people are saying, because there are millions of people on social media commenting, and they are sort of absorbing this. And I think sometimes that their policies are then being reflected through what's being put on social media. That was my point.
I think that's probably true. I think what has happened, and this applies before Twitter. Certainly over the last, you get this if you read the Alistair Campbell diaries about the Labour government, is that the reaction time for stories has shrunk massively. So whenever a scandal erupts or something emerges, politicians no longer have time to think about how to respond. They always have to respond really, really quickly. And I don't know how they manage it. I think it would drive me around the bend to have to be constantly responding to all these demands.
I think Alistair Campbell said before, if a story is running for more than 3 days, I think that was his kind of benchmark.
Yeah.
Now, it can be on Twitter within 30 seconds of something happening.
Yeah.
And then that's what the media then focus on. They focus on the new surge in Twitter. You know, BBC Question Time, it's always hashtag Twitter, and the comments are coming in their thousands. You know, so it is a new reality. I'm just saying, there's a new reality to election time, and social media is driving this very, very strongly, and it'd be interesting to see how it pans out.
Yeah, I think, I mean, on the other side, I mean, you're right. So I think one of the other interesting things is the way in which it may, for all the negative things we can think about it may actually have a positive effect. And I'm thinking particularly of the ways in which politicians, A, get their messages out, and B, raise money. And if they do what the Obama campaign did in America and actually start to try and reach out more to ordinary voters and bypass the parties and explain themselves and raise funding and so forth in that way, then it may cut out some of the heavy reliance that particularly the Westminster political elite have on powerful, wealthy people in London and lobbyists and so forth. But you know, that's maybe that's just idealism or hope.
Thank you.
Did we have one last question just over here?
Thank you again. When I was a little boy, we went to get a suit and it was tailor-made. Now, you get it off the shelf. And I think that's what I have had in the hustings. When I've asked a question, I haven't had an answer, I've had an off the shelf. And I think that's how they do it. You know, you were saying you don't know how politicians manage to come up with the answers because they don't answer the questions, they answer what they hope have been asked. On to the point, housing, I don't see a great deal. I think even Evan Davis has recognised now that housing is a commodity. It's not for living in, it's a commodity to be bought and sold like cotton or wool or coffee or tea. It's also an investment, and we have seen increasingly, particularly in London, the Russian and Chinese oligarchs buying up vast amounts, some off-plan, not even built, leaving it empty. Yes, leaving it empty so that investment will rise. This is spreading throughout the country now. What do you think lies behind the words that they've got here that's going to address that? Because building more houses, as we've seen in terms of the housing associations, the next government will just come in and say, thank you, there's the private sector again. Is there anything in there that is actually going to address taking back housing as into being somewhere to live rather than a commodity?
I don't think any of the parties are talking about housing in those terms. I think they all accept the logic or rationale, which actually is not, it's not unique to the United Kingdom, but it certainly makes it an exception a little bit in some of the countries in Europe, that we focus on home ownership as almost the defining goal of adult life. One of the things we want to do is own our own home, and housing ownership has gone up, well, it's obviously it's fluctuated a bit recently, but it's gone up very, very dramatically over the last century, and it's seen as it's almost like the gold standard of adult life. But if you look, I mean, I'll put one or two things about housing, and I noticed that I didn't have time to put them all in because I was again on the wrong list. But there is a bit about housing in all of the manifestos. Now we've got the one at the top of the Tory where the extension of the right to buy to housing association tenants, which is obviously quite controversial. But if you look at the bottom there, there's 200,000 subsidised starter homes for first-time buyers under 40. Now, if you look at the Conservative and the Liberal Democrats and Labour manifestos, they've also got commitments to build more houses, but they're not talking about it in terms of subsidised starter homes. I think the Lib Dem target is either 200,000 or 300,000 new houses per year. But I don't think, if I remember rightly, it says how they will do that. I think Labour has also got a target, maybe slightly lower. I think the Lib Dems made 300,000, Labour 200,000. But they're not talking about if you like these two methods. You could regard them as typically conservative strategies. Housing association sell-offs back to the 1980s, really, in a way. And subsidised starter homes. I think the subsidy is going to be like 20% below market price. And some people have said that's not going to have a very good effect on the housing market. It may actually make things worse. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a housing economist, so I can't say. But it's it's not about just let's build more houses.
Perhaps I didn't explain myself. I mean, that's housing to buy.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is housing to possibly rent, because you can't buy. And that seems to be, unlike the Germans and the Swedes, etc., where you've got continuation of tenure.
Yeah.
I could just answer that very briefly because I'm just very aware that we're reaching the end.
Yeah, well, the short answer is I wouldn't say, I can't recall when I went to the Labour manifesto whether there was any, that would be the most likely place to find it. I can't recall whether there was anything on that, but I wouldn't say there wasn't. So just have a look and see if there was anything.
Thank you.
Okay. I think you've given us much food for thought, Jim. A week before the election, a lot to ponder on. That was a really interesting, really nuanced paper. Thank you very much. And you've been a really fantastic audience, so thank you all very much.